Well, welcome to part 2 of the 2023 winter webinars Informing Assessment Policy series of the Committee for Informing Assessment Policy of the National Council of Measurement of Education. That's a lot to say, and I could have said it all in alphabet and in acronyms, but I just want to thank you all for showing up. I think we have a great panel and a great topic today. My name is Regina Lewis, and I'm a member of the CIAP, which is the committee sponsoring the webinar, and I'm the moderator for this session. The CIAP would like to thank the state and local assessment leaders, the SIGME, for their support and participation in today's session and panel discussion. And if you're not currently a member of NCME, we hope that you consider membership in our organization and examine the numerous resources available, such as our educational items modules and our NCME YouTube channel. Today's session provides an opportunity for a fireside chat style discussion about the progress of several states' transition to through-year assessment and the usefulness of the resulting data for informing its diverse demands. The panel membership includes representatives from state educational agencies in transition to a model attempting to reconcile the diverse set of challenges and the demands of state assessment. Our panel members include Trudy Clark from Nebraska Department of Education, Tammy Howard from North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, Shelley Living-Rider from Virginia Department of Education, Vince Vergis from Florida Department of Education, and we have Scott Marion here from the Center of Assessment. He's the executive director. All right, to begin our conversation, let's explore the state goals for transitioning to a through-year design. Okay, now if one of my panelists might volunteer, our questions are: why and how did the state decide to transition to this through-year design? And what problem were you trying to solve? Or who was involved in that decision-making process, and how long did it take? If you have any other goals or reasons for making the transition, be happy to just add those in.
Well, good afternoon. I'll go first, Regina. So in North Carolina, as I'm sure in my colleagues in their states as well, we've heard for quite some time overwhelming feedback that the end of year assessments do not give information in a timely manner that allow for teachers or parents to address their children's learning. And that's particularly true in North Carolina because we have a state law that we administer our assessments the last 5 or 10 days of the school year, depending upon the schedule for the school. So that's absolutely the truth in that matter. So our progression to looking at through grade was trying to provide information that would support the learning throughout the school year. And that's one of the reasons why our model was a little bit different, and that our focus on those through-year assessments is more of a formative nature, a classroom-based nature, and not contributing directly to the summative end of year score, because we were trying to address that concern from parents and from teachers.
And I would say Nebraska, of course, echoes that concern from our educators about the weight that had to come in order to get scores. And so, of course, you wouldn't be able to really utilize them for instruction. And that's really what we want assessment to do, is be able to help drive instruction and make those decisions that are really going to be powerful for our students to learn. We had that conversation in Nebraska as well. It really then came into, for the decision-making process, about 2016, NDE and the State Board of Education came together and developed a strategic plan to sort of guide how we would enter into this process. And there were a huge number of stakeholders that were involved in this as well, having those conversations, wanting to make sure that they were on board, what that would look like. And ultimately, we settled on a through year process, what that might look like. Initially, the design was with NSCAS growth, there would be 2 components, a growth score and a scale score that would lead to for accountability. And that has changed this year. There were some real concerns around the growth score, and so we've made some adjustments to compensate for that. And I'll go into more detail a little bit later, but the whole process really was, again, centered around how can we provide actionable data or data that's going to help the teachers make the decisions that they need to help our students.
Rudy, when you say growth score, do you mean within year growth as opposed to year growth?
Yes, within
Okay,
year.
thanks.
So in Virginia, the goal was very similar to what Tammy and Trudy have discussed. One difference is ours was the result of legislation in the 2021 General Assembly. And there, of course, as other participants have noted, interest in providing more immediate and actionable information. Because of the timing of the legislation, there was also interest in finding additional ways to identify learning gaps that might have occurred during the pandemic. And then additionally, one of the goals was to provide a measure of within year growth. We had been measuring growth from spring to spring. The legislation was passed in the spring of 21, and we administered for the first time in August of 21. So it was a very quick implementation. So it was a phased implementation with changes that did occur in this school year. So 21-22 was a bit different than what we administered this year because of that phased approach. And I can certainly talk about that a little later, Regina.
Fabulous. How about you, Vince?
Yeah, so similarly, the main driver was to get more information, more actionable information in the hands of teachers and families more quickly. We had started with legislation, our 2021 legislative session, that really just called for a progress monitoring system, a through-year assessment system to kind of monitor progress along the way. At that time, we still had a statutory requirement for a separate summative assessment. So we put out procurement for that through-year assessment system. And then in the 2022 legislative session, which ended in March, we had signed into law that we would not do a summative assessment any longer. We would turn that through-year assessment system into our not only a through-year assessment, but we'd use our end-of-year results from year to year for our accountability system. We'll talk more about the design later, but incredibly, like Shelley and Virginia, we actually executed the contract 48 days prior to the implementation of the assessment. And since then, our first two events, we call them Progress Monitoring 1 in the fall and Progress Monitoring 2 in the spring, we've completed, administered over 10 million assessments and without issues, unbelievably, but it was just an incredibly, I just didn't think it was possible to implement something so quickly.
It might not be. Have you implemented it yet?
Rock and rolling, 10 million.
All right, there you go. Good. Yeah, it's interesting, Regina. So everybody seems to be singing from a common song sheet that they're getting pressure from the field that they want actionable data, that the state summative assessment doesn't give them actionable data. It takes me. I was once in their shoes and your shoes back in Wyoming 100 years ago. And I remember a principal calling me up at the end of the year and just, ripping me up one side and down the other because this test was too late and they couldn't use any of this information to inform instruction for kids. And I just said, what have you been doing all year? And because that's not my job, that's your job. And so has that come up at all that, that's not your job to provide instructional useful information through the year or I mean, I know a lot of it's driven by legislation and state board, but does that come up at all as a conversation that this is not what these were designed for?
We did, you know, I'll give you an example. We pushed back, there's a request for student performance at the benchmark level. They said, can you
Right.
do this? And we said, yes, you can. You know, let's say benchmark, a student sees 4 items and they want to see how many items did the student get and how many did they get correct. We said, we can do that, but we should not. But the powers that be actually made us do that, you know, so
Right.
we are reporting that. And so it'll be, and the other instructional resources, we've been asked to provide some interpretive material a little bit beyond what I thought we would normally do, but I think we're using our achievement level descriptions. We're offering that and saying, listen, here's what the achievement level descriptions say about what students know and can do, you know, from there, you know, PLDs, of course, as many people call them. From there, it's up to you to get those resources up and running.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, absolutely what Vince said. We can bring it up, but it does not get any traction. And I've actually said that recently to a liaison with our legislative body. I said, I've said this before and it doesn't seem to get any traction. And he said, oh, absolutely, it does not. and I think that it is because there is so much negative press and negative perception about the end of year assessment, which is tied to accountability. And that's really what folks don't like. But one of the things that they can try to change is the test. And I will say that, Vince, I keep bringing up as well that some of the press coverage I see from Florida is that, you know, this actually adds to the testing burden. It doesn't take away from it. Our structure is a little bit different in that we're trying to keep them classroom centered and not, you know, a high stakes or accountability framed assessment, because it doesn't tie into that summative academic achievement level. But nevertheless, ultimately, at the end of the day, it does increase the time that students are sitting down in front of a test.
Right.
I think we've been trying to treat the results of what we call the through-year growth assessments as another piece of information and trying to help people fit that into a larger assessment system. And again, focusing on it's just one piece of information that comes from a fairly short assessment that should be used in addition to the summative assessments from the previous year. And then we have a series of formative classroom assessments that are tied to lesson plans that we try to encourage teachers to use to identify where the issues are. In other words, the growth assessments and the summative assessments will give some sense of where a student might have issues, but we try to encourage teachers to realize that they're going to need to do something at the classroom level to really get out where the misunderstanding is and to address it.
I wasn't in the department when all of this conversation began, but I do know that the message had always been this is part of a balanced assessment system that the school districts need to have created for themselves, that this is, again, just one piece. And it's not the role of the state to say this is what you have to have in your balanced assessment system, but it's something that all districts need to consider as they build their systems.
Yeah, Regina, there's a good question in the chat. I thought folks should feel free to put questions in there. But this question, and this is something that come up, and it's some, I know some of you now are not, it depends on how, we can't define any terms in this field, it seems like, but a couple of my colleagues define through year as the through the year components do contribute to a summative score. It sounds like some of you are saying, no, those are separate from the summative score. But the question in the chat is a pretty good one. You know, we think of the end of year as when kids are able to demonstrate that they could actually synthesize across multiple standards and do things in a little more complex ways, as opposed to when we chunk it up through the year. So I think the question is the current end of year reflective of that desire to have this more comprehensive look at kids' achievement, or is it just one more component through the year that, you know, it's like the fourth quarter exam as opposed to the final exam? And it might, I'm sure it differs across all of your states. I think, Tammy, I think in your case, right, when you're trying to do that delayed stage adaptive, what you're trying to do, you had to make the end of year more
That's right.
comprehensive, right?
Right, the end of year would be really our, in fact, in our design, we are administering this spring for grades 4 and 7, our what we call a flexible summative. Now, we do use the information from the through grade to place students into the flexible summative, but then once you get placed, you're on your own, and what you've done previously on those through grade do not contribute to that. And we feel like that's very important, because students, what they know in November is, and if you measure that in November, then you would hope that by the end of the school year, maybe there would be some change. And we've offered that up as a reason to be very cautious in this model of wanting to combine the through grade into an outcome for that academic achievement level, which is really now the big ask that we have, is they want to roll those through grade together. And we try to make the point, but do you really want to measure in November and hold a student accountable when maybe in May or June they know that information? Don't you want to give them the opportunity to show you? And our content experts internally in our office, they make the point that our reading content standards specify reading at the end of the 4th grade, for example. So it's very important, you know, to think about what you're actually trying to measure. And we do have a growth model in North Carolina. And so that's the other point we try to make, is you want that end of year summative for that growth information. Again, you don't want to, you know, shortchange students in showing you what they know and they're able to do by you know, depending on how you rolled it up, not giving them an opportunity again. So I think that gets to what you were asking, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, it does. But is that, so, I mean, your model, is it different than what you were doing with your NC check-ins before? That's really, you know, they weren't really contributing. The NC check-ins were your interim tools that people were using.
Right.
Is this any different if it doesn't count in some of, and I think that's the right way to do it, but that's a different story. But is that any different than what you were doing before?
Well,
And I won't tell the legislature, I promise.
well, the backstory of this is I was struck when Shelley, you know, went back to 2012, and I think our year was 2015. But we had a task force that looked at testing and, of course, wanted to change testing, and they recommended a through grade at that time. And our response was, well, let's go over here and do this NC, what we called NC check-ins. And it started out as a pilot, started out as a proof of concept, started out very small, and it just kept building and building and building. But what we have said consistently is that this is a long-term project, that we do not know how to get to. The end goal of what we're hearing is the end goal, which is to have that through grade assessment where we are combining across the year. That we're not there yet, and we definitely were not there in 2015. So we started out with this NC check-ins, and now our through grade are called NC check-ins 2.0. And there have been some changes in how we structure them and give some flexibility with them. So I would say they have evolved from 2015, and they're much stronger than they were in 2015. But we had the same question in 2015, and that's what was the incentive to do what we did then. And then when we were, you know, it was decided that we would apply for the authority from the U.S. Department of Education, then our recommendation was to build upon what we had already done and to continue. And I would see us continuing to do that. You know, we don't have the capability to do it now, but it's on our plan to possibly have data from the NC check-ins 2.0 have a predictive value to the end of grade. So we don't know for sure if we would be able to do that, but I think our psychometricians are very committed to continuing to look and see what the possibilities are, and you know, where we could strengthen the program even more.
But hey, Vince, Lori has a question for you in the chat.
And again, I think this, how people do these things in other states might be of interest. So, since we use the same bank, the same blueprint, obviously the beginning of the year, you've got content that students haven't seen yet. We have our 5 achievement level, with level 1 being the lowest, 5 the highest. So obviously, as you can imagine, first year testing in the spring, we had lots and lots and lots and lots of level 1 students. So we haven't changed the interpretation other than to tell folks, I mean, parents included, of students who usually score level 5s. Just because you score level 1 now doesn't necessarily mean you're not on track, for the end of the year. So we've had to provide additional context like percentile ranks, which has kind of helped them with those, that information. Fortunately for now, those first 2 events for us are for informational purposes only. We're not using any, accountability purposes or growth yet from year to year. That may happen, and it won't happen until the earliest of 2025 legislative session. So a lot of challenges to overcome. And we've told people, always expect under this model, PM1 results will always be suppressed. It's not going to be magically, we've got new standards and kids will do better next year on the first event, because you'll always have kids that are new to the standards and content.
Virginia is somewhat similar in that we are using the same item bank for our through course assessments as we are for the end of year summative. At this point, we have left the end of year summative alone, and it continues to be a proficiency exam. This year, we had a fall and a winter through year assessment. And this year, for the first time, we did test on current year content. So a 5th grade student got content on the fall and winter growth assessment that was 5th grade content. So like Vince, we are thinking about how we help teachers interpret that information. Last year in 21-22, the fall assessment was based on the content the student had been taught the previous year. So our 5th grader got 4th grade content. And that was particularly helpful in 21-22 because of the pandemic. We did have students who didn't have a spring 21 score, and it was also helpful for teachers to identify, learning gaps that might have been present at the beginning of the year. The law that put this into place did require us to move to the current grade level content this year in 22-23. We did modify the CAT algorithm so that we are pulling off grade items down 1 grade level and up a grade level. But as Vince said, we are struggling with providing information about how to interpret the scores, and we are also providing percentile ranks just as contextual information.
Nebraska.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to share, Nebraska has changed from the original concept of through year. We had anticipated offering computer adaptive for the test design, but then it would be a summative with a growth component. The growth the students would have access, the algorithm would send them up 1 grade above, 1 grade below, and then there would be a scale score based on just that time of year. So originally we thought to utilize this as a banking kind of system, but that went out the window basically with the response to concerns around that growth component. Just going 1 grade above and 1 grade below really did not meet the students' needs for those who were going to need to be challenged, and then those students that really needed to be met at their grade level if they were below. So this year, the design is 2 grades above, but then there is no floor, so to speak. So as we provide this assessment, we've also come away from the notion that there was going to be requirement for fall and spring, and it's still maintained as a opportunity to take it, but it's not required in fall or winter, but it is required in the spring. And so the spring is the only accountability measurement that we are taking, but there is that growth component that still is available for those that are interested in taking that opportunity.
Okay, so we've had a question that kind of builds on that, which is about the feedback that you're getting that is causing, you folks to modify your decisions or the method. Has any of the feedback been received by teachers about the usefulness of the results? Is that where some of these changes are coming from, and what's happening with reporting to the parents, and how are the results provided to them?
I think the reporting was one of the drivers, because the reports that they were getting, especially around the growth information, was not what they were used to. They were using a particular interim assessment, and they were used to a real depth of information, where the student was on a continuum, some very classroom basic classroom level information, and that was not what they were getting from the reporting system that we were offering initially. That is changing. We're going to bring the reports more in line with what they are used to seeing, but there is still some concern that that's not going to be far enough. So it's the reporting and the rostering and the ticketing. I think those are the three areas that have caused the greatest consternation on the part of the folks who have to actually operate within the system. And those are the folks that we're listening to. As far as the teachers, we've heard from a couple teachers, but most of who we're listening to are our district assessment coordinators, our principals, our other contents, or the specialists in learning and curriculum, and some superintendents, by the way.
But Trudy, I think Rochelle's question is really asking, it's great that you're trying to do this with for teachers, for parents. Has anybody sat down with teachers or school folks and looked at the 3-year reports and see how they're talking about adjusting instruction or not, or how they're interpreting these reports? Are they finding them useful? And it's an evidence-based question, right?
Yeah, we collect feedback, but it's not been a face-to-face necessarily.
Okay.
We do have teachers coming in always on the summers and doing the kind of item writing and all of those pieces, alignment studies and content bias, all of those pieces. So the teachers are at the table then. And so there are opportunities for us to collect feedback, but during the testing season, it's more of a response to a survey that they have access to.
In North Carolina, we have had some face-to-face observations. We've had some focus groups. We've had some interviews. We shared the individual student report with a parent group. We have tried to get as much input as we can. We have periodic webinars that are really targeted for the teachers, which is a little bit different, because typically our conversations occur with the district testing staff or accountability staff. So we've tried to do that as well. And the teachers, we have a really good response, but it's how it's framed, with it being a classroom assessment, and ours is not measuring all of the content standards every time. Our particularly math, now reading is the same content standards on each of the 3 events, but mathematics is broken up across the 3 assessments. But locally they can decide in what order they want to administer those. So, but the feedback that we've gotten from the teachers and the principals that we have taught with has been very positive. Now, I think that would change if it became rolling those assessment results up into the end of year academic achievement level that impacts accountability. Then that would become a very different conversation.
in Virginia, I think it's been a bit difficult that we have changed the assessment after 1 year. So, last year in 21-22, the growth assessments measured the previous year's content. This year they measure current year content. So it's been a little more difficult for teachers to get in the habit of using the information. We are hearing that we have some teachers who are using the growth information to identify students who may have similar learning needs and providing remediation. We did use the opportunity of adding these assessments to implement a parent portal. We had not had that in Virginia before. That has been fairly successful. This year, we've had an increased use of that portal by parents. They have access to a question level report within about a week of their students taking their assessments. And then for most students, there's also a video that goes along with that report that describes the results. So that has been helpful. But as far as teachers, we're still working with teachers since there was the change in the way the assessment was configured.
So,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead, Vince.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Vince.
Yeah, in Florida, we have results that are available almost immediately to parents and teachers within 24 hours. They're populated. We also have a family portal. Based on the questions that we're getting, it seems like people are really digging into the information. We have a state level dashboard, a district level dashboard, and we've granted a number of state support staff. We call them state regional literacy directors for the reading, and our regional executive directors that work on behalf of the department and go around the state and help districts. And based on the kinds of questions, interactions we're getting with those groups and the schools they're working with, they seem to be digging into the data, even though, as I said, we learned early in PM1 that kids haven't learned the content yet, but now they're anxious to see, are we going to provide some kind of growth trajectories now that the second window has closed? You can see definite growth, and now they want to know what's going to be the typical growth. Are we going to provide recommended growth? Even though we don't plan on using it for accountability at this point, they still want to know how much growth is enough and where can I expect my kids to be, which is very natural. So we're still working through some of those things.
Hey, Vince, have you guys thought about this? Question came to me in a private chat. It's what if a kid scores level 5 on the beginning of the year, and maybe the next one, like you say, well, just sit there for the rest of the year in that class, or what's the discussion around? I'm sure you're going to have some kids doing that.
We have hundreds of students in every grade scoring at the in the top level. So part of the implementing law for this requires a study to be conducted, completed by January 31st of 2025. That might be used for the 25 legislative session for the 25-26 school year. That will answer a lot of those questions. Can you accelerate students based on PM1 or PM2, or can you factor that into accountability to, have districts put those grades, quote unquote, in the bag? And we also have the third grade promotion requirement and grade 10 graduation requirement for ELA assessments and Algebra 1 assessment requirements. So right now we don't have the legal authority to use those scores. Again, our Algebra 1 test is not part of our through year, but can we use the grade 10 test to meet requirements? So potentially yes, and I think we'd be hard pressed to say no, you can't.
I'd like to broaden that question. We're talking about students who are top performers. How about our English learners and our students with disabilities? This question was posted in the chat. How are you folks finding that they're doing? What considerations are you making for them?
I'll just jump in really quickly. We used to have schools, bubble in things, or students took a paper-based test and shipped them back to the vendor. So we have paper-based, large print, 1 item per page, everything except for Braille, where we're having schools input that data directly, like we currently do with our alternate assessment, and then so that they can have the benefit of that immediate scoring. We haven't worked out the audit system to kind of make sure that the teachers are faithfully entering what the student actually did, but we think we have solutions for that equitable treatment of those students.
I just want to do a side note about how well I can attest of how many pieces of Florida paper was shipped back to the vendors. I looked at all of it for like 5 years in person, so.
Our system offers universal as well as embedded accommodations. Those are all set by the system, the school system, and so accommodations are available. We do have a Braille option at Nebraska. A large print paper is available. We try to make sure that all students have access to the computer adaptive system, just because we feel that that's a better option for most students. And we do have the alternate assessment that's available for those 1% of our population that are most cognitively challenged and would not be able to access the what we call the general assessment.
We have very limited paper, and we've made an effort to make sure that students that have to have paper are the ones who cannot access the computer. But yet then we, like Florida, we have a way that that data gets entered into the system so that they can get reported out with their peers, so that they're not broken out separately. But I think also important with the through grade model that North Carolina has, by making it more classroom, making it more user friendly, not locking the school down, it not being a full-blown end of year assessment. It's specified content standards, it's shorter, and we're not leaning over their shoulder telling them exactly what to do. We actually did not want to provide a script. And the teachers, of course, are very used to a script, and they convinced us through their feedback loop that they needed some sort of script. So we gave them a very toned down one. But I think that what I'm trying to convey here is that that type of assessment, to get information, to give back to parents, to give back to teachers, to give back to the students, for them to have information on areas that they may need to work on, that is more supportive, I think, of our English learners and our students with disabilities. And we're trying to remove some of the stress and pressure. We don't want these through grade assessments to be another mini EOG. I have a great niece who is in one of our colleagues here state, and I asked her recently how she had taken one of these through grade assessments recently, and I was trying to ask a 10-year-old, were you nervous? Was it an anxious experience? And she basically said, yes, it was. And I said, really? And she said, yes. And her grandmother was like, but why? And she said, well, when everybody is stressed because you might not be able to go to the next grade. And of course, this is a child that does very well. She does very, very well. And I'll also say that I tried to get her to tell me how many items were on the assessment. And she told me they were told they could not discuss the assessment, and she would not tell me. So.
You tell her you have special privileges? No. I think before Andrew writes another manuscript on yet more W's, I don't know if we want to address his question in the chat. I think it's really an important one. He's asking about the examples of claims that your respective states are trying to support about students and schools from early in the year. Are they meant to be just descriptive? We heard some of this. Of the knowledge and skills at that time, and Vince and some others said no, they're end of year claims. Are they meant to be predictive, predicting end of year proficiency or scores? Are they meant to be reported publicly, or are they just for teachers or parents? Maybe talk about how you're thinking about this earlier in the year components, whether it's the first or second, something like that.
With the I'm sorry, go ahead, Tammy.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, with the original design, we had made the claim, and I hope I'm correct here. The claim was, with the design, if a student met the blueprint and for some reason they could not take the test in the spring, that was always the tagline. If the student could not take the test in the spring, then if they had taken the test in the fall, then we would be able to utilize that only in special circumstances. That was just a way to make sure that we had a student have the opportunity to have a test experience that would provide them with the accountability information. We no longer make that claim. We can only claim that accountability is in the spring because of how we changed the test design. And the ALDs that we use to inform the test design allow us to look at the progressions that a student might make. Those achievement level descriptors are part of the feedback that the student gets from each test administration that they participate in.
But in the beginning of the year, it's not meant to be accountability claim. It's meant to be what they know at that point.
At that
in the year
particular, yes.
relative to where we think they should be, right?
Yes.
Like, so you haven't like chunked out the standards or anything like that?
No, we
Doing
have
that.
not. No,
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Right.
We have not.
Okay. So
We-
what about, go ahead, Tammy.
We have chunked out the standards
Right.
for mathematics. And the challenge there, of course, is that different school districts may have pacing guides. And there are some that tell us that they do not participate because it's voluntary, that they do not participate because of that misalignment between their pacing guide and the 3 assessments, even though they can choose which assessment they want to give in which order. And that was a change that came along the way, partly because of this pacing guide situation. But as far as claims, we do try to emphasize with respect to items that a student may not have been taught the information, that that is still valuable information, because there are some students who will take those items and they'll know that information. And so that is valuable information to know that Susie already knows that concept. But ours is, I think, still a little bit different because we're emphasizing information for the teacher. We don't report out a scale score or a percentile. The teacher gets a class item roster of the students and then referencing every test item, whether or not the student got it correct and what the correct answer was. Well, I said that incorrectly. What the student answered, A, B, C, D, for example, and then what the correct answer was. And then they have access to the test booklet for a certain amount of time that they can go back and the student can see it too. And that's to help them have that conversation and understanding of where the student's thinking may not be what we want it to be for them to be successful on those items. So with our reporting through the class item report, and not having a scale score, not having a percentile, and they want those things. They kind of push for them, absolutely, but we're trying to hold firm and not giving that. And even on the individual student report that parents get, we don't ever, we have kind of like a scale, if you will, with a little button that goes across a continuum, but it's not a number. So they don't know the number of items that their student got correct. So we're trying to make it as informative as we can, but at the same time, not having it look exactly like an end of year assessment.
Thanks.
So yeah, we are reporting out scale scores and also scale scores for the reporting category. We're telling for each reporting category whether you're below expectations, at or near expectations, which is around that cut score, that level 3, which is for us on grade, or above expectations for each one. We have not yet put out aggregates for after the PMs, but we know we're working on that because we know that's something we're probably inevitably going to have to do. Just even if the results after the first fall test aren't exactly encouraging, it is public information. So we are going to provide those eventually.
I think many of us are impacted by the fact that our assessments were legislated, and in Virginia, our assessments have to be about half the length of the spring summative assessment. So, we're talking about a very short test to use that information. So we don't aggregate, and the percentiles that I referenced earlier, we are providing this year to provide some contextual information about how students performed in comparison to the rest of the state, because we don't really have other interpretable information to provide. The hope is that once we have the spring data, we'll be able to provide more information about where students perhaps should be at the beginning of the year. We have not divided the content as North Carolina has. It is essentially the same blueprint as the summative assessment, but it's shorter. So sort of I guess a shortened version of what we do with the summative assessment. So we have been really careful not to provide aggregate information or any sort of performance level information because of the nature of the assessments.
So Shelley, they actually mandated test length. Not only that you had to do this, but they mandated the length of the 3-year components.
So the total testing time could not exceed 150 times of the summative assessment. Now, that's a little challenging because in Virginia, the summative assessment is untimed. So it's hard to multiply 150 by untimed. But we took that to mean we needed to have about a half-length assessment. So that's where we are.
John Twing could probably do it. Look at all the books he's got in his library to
Yeah.
figure that out. So it's wow. So that's right. For all our NCME friends, the living in the state assessment world where you think that you just get to design something that best fits the intended purposes and uses, but you have legislators, dictating testing time and occasions and things like that. It makes it really challenging.
Yeah, one aspect is, about and ours is essentially a pre, mid, and post-test model is, having that on grade level content. And I think I saw that this speaks to one of the questions about districts and states, or districts are using these other tools because we may use this for accountability purposes. We're not letting schools go below grade level. So if they want to know how far below grade, is it 1 or is it 2 grades, they're using these other tools. And so, we do have the state requirement that no more than 5% of any student's instruction can be taken by assessment, be taken up by assessments. And we required a report where we looked at all districts' tests, including statewide assessments, these other tools that they might use for diagnostics and what other district assessments they're using, and nobody's above 5%. So 5% is a high bar, we think, but there's some at 3 and 4%. So if you're under the state requirement, I don't know that districts are going to be willing to, to abandon those other tools because it gives them that well below grade information for Florida.
Right.
Okay, well, there is a question here expanding, I think, on many of the things we've talked about already but particularly about the students with disabilities and English learners. And it was more about the design in terms of the content organization and how one administration informs another, and if you're using elements for accountability, and some of you have already touched on, whether all the standards are tested every time, or and whether your assessment is computer adaptive and how that works, but how are they used? Is there a way that informs the next assessment, and how does that work with those students with disabilities and English learners?
Our design was meant to inform the next assessment that they took if they were as the original design of the assessment, and there is that component still a part of it, where the prior test administration will inform the next. But as far as how this impacts English language learners and students with disabilities, again, I'm going to have to go back to my original comment about the way that we allow, or that there are accommodations for them. I'm not quite sure how else to meet that question. Sorry.
I would like to share that, so we have 3 through grade assessments. You have to take at least 2 for the psychometricians to then take that information and route students into the flexible summative. So the flexible summative is basically 3 different forms, but on the same scale. But those 3 forms, of course, there's a form for students who did really well on the NC Check-ins 2.0. There's a form for the students who did not do really well, and then there's a middle form. And we would expect most students to be in that middle form. And that's really one of the biggest challenges we have is when our colleagues across the state start talking about that design and trying to understand that, because of course they're concerned. Their first question is, well, what's to prevent a student from not doing well all year long on the NC Check-ins 2.0? So they then get the I'll use the word lower, getting the right language here is very hard, right? And particularly for other audiences, not perhaps for this call, but what is to prevent those students from, doing that and then getting the lower form? And we have a hard time convincing them that that's not going to give them an advantage. That any student on any one of those 3 forms has the capacity to score level 5. We would not expect a lot of level 5s on that lower range form, obviously, as we would not expect non-proficients on the higher form, realizing you can have some anomalies there. But I think part of the design from the very beginning with our psychometricians has been to get more precision at either end of the scale. So more precision with those high performing students and more precision with those lower performing students, which many of our English learners and students with disabilities are. The precision, as we all know, is around wherever your cut score is for proficiency. For us is level 3. So we're trying to get more definition of the scale. That doesn't really sell very well to our public, to our teachers and our parents and other educators across the state, or to our General Assembly members. But I do think, and we feel as though, and one of the things I try to say sometimes is the testing experience will be better for those students, particularly those students at the lower end of the scale, because we hear anecdotally that students sometimes enter a testing session, they get very frustrated, they can't answer their items, they put their head on the desk and they go to sleep, or they're just totally disengaged, or they're very upset. So hopefully they'll have a better testing experience, but navigating that and saying in a way that is meaningful is something that we are still working on. So if anyone on this call has any help in that arena, please reach out because we can definitely use it.
Tammy, what the folks, many of the folks in the audience, I'm sure realizes is what you're doing is a stage adaptive test. You're just delaying this. You have a lot of time in between the stages. Typically, this occurs over a day or 2. And you're just stretching it out over 9 months or 8 months. And so that's the thing. I don't know if there's any instances of that happening before folks like you and others who are engaged in this, because not everybody's doing this design. That's something I should say to folks in the audience. We're talking about through year like it's one thing. And one of the things we've learned, there's many flavors of through year, probably as Baskin and Robbins has ice cream, and it's and they're all approaching it different ways. So yeah, it would be interesting. But I think in your case, what I heard from Kingay is that you had to make that middle end of year test, the one that's the middle level, so wide because you had to accommodate so many kids who would miss several of the check-ins along the way, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that does speak to, I really hadn't thought of it that way, Scott, but you're exactly right. We are looking at moving to, once this is a mature system, that once kids have a score in the system, for the first one, we can use that as a starting point for the second one and for the third one and so on. So, I will say, I think you're right, it is kind of staged up that way, but I need to say that the mathematics tests are basically item adaptive. And then for reading, we have these item sets that are related to passages. And so we currently have four passage or passage sets and then items associated with. And so in that way, it's kind of block adaptive within a test where a student takes a passage, the middle level of distribution, answers questions, and based on their responses, they'll get the next set of items or the passage set and the items that go with it. So, but yeah, overall, it does become a long-term stage adaptive test.
Virginia is computer adaptive as well, adaptive at the item level for math and passage level for reading. And right now we are carrying the student's ability level forward. So the starting point on the winter assessment is the ending theta for the fall assessment.
Okay, I'm gonna flip this a little bit to the federal requirements. Is the transition to your model creating any additional challenges to meeting the federal requirements for accountability? That's loaded.
Well, when Governor DeSantis says we're getting rid of high stakes testing, my phone rang and it was Don Peasley just a few minutes later. But I assured him that ultimately the design, and even if we do implement that, use those first and second tests, we know that we want to meet all the requirements of federal peer review.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that is something that we're consistently reminding stakeholders and policymakers are the requirements from the U.S. Department of Education and federal law. Doesn't always get traction, but nevertheless, we keep emphasizing it. And in the long run, I think that is understood.
This guy Chris Domaleski put this question in the chat. And maybe it's too soon to tell, but a lot of folks are concerned about over testing, right? So are any of you seeing any of your local education agencies reduce their use of the commercial interim assessments or other type of testing, or is it like just layering on more testing than to the already full camel's back?
Scott, we are seeing that in Virginia. In Virginia, students are required to participate in the through-year assessments. And so we are seeing that some of our school districts are abandoning their use of commercial assessments that they were using to measure growth or benchmarks. There has been some concern from the vendors who had been selling those tests. But yes, we are seeing some reduction at this point.
In North Carolina, our through grade are voluntary, so it varies. I will say, in general, larger school systems have more funds. If they use the through grade, the NC Check-ins 2.0, they also may continue to administer other vendor assessments. The appreciation for a cost savings comes from smaller school districts who say that this really gives them a resource that they otherwise would not have. But on an aside, we do have a state law about local benchmarks where we have to collect that information from the school districts in North Carolina, and we report every 2 years to the General Assembly how many they have and if they are within the state average. So the General Assembly has sent a very clear message about minimizing benchmark assessments. And we do, in good faith, encourage when we're having conversations with our colleagues at districts, to not just layer on NC Check-ins 2.0, but to look at your benchmarks and make decisions based on what is beneficial for your programs and your schools and your goals and your purposes and your uses. Do not just add one more assessment. If you're adding NC Check-ins 2.0, then perhaps you should think about maybe taking something else away. But we don't tell them, we don't go that far to actually probably say that. We kind of scale it back a little bit.
And that was actually one of the points that we tried to make when we were first bringing this to our educators, that the model that we had anticipated using would have at least halved the number of assessments that a student in grades 3 through 8 would be taking through the year. We we still believe that that's the case. However, as I alluded to, there is a continuing concern around the growth measurement that we have as part of our state assessment. And so that's the reason why it remains optional for fall and winter. And we believe that there are many districts that have returned to the interim assessment that they had already been using, and used the spring as the accountability piece. And that's a choice that they've made. Don't always agree with their choices, but that's their local control. And I believe everybody knows those two words very well.
And I kind of alluded to this when I mentioned about the 5%. So, you know, in addition to knowing where students are, how far below grade level they are, we didn't see a very big drop so far. And I think one of the reasons, because this was such a new animal, we had news tests aligned to brand new standards. And I think districts were remiss to give up something that they at least had this, that they've been using for years. So they would know until they knew more about standard setting and cut scores, this would give them an idea, more longitudinal data.
Right. And that was something difficult for us to argue against, was that longitudinal data that they had for years and years. And so it's completely understandable, and recognize that that's something that they value. It's, again, local control and making sure that they get the data that's going to help inform learning and instruction specifically for their students.
Yeah, it is easy to understand. State assessments change, as we're all seeing, pretty frequently. And so for local districts, they feel like they could control something. And if they have a desire for, now, I don't see a lot of them using 10 years worth of data. I see them using, a few years of data for, how long a school board term is. But yeah. As a former school board member, I could say that. So. Mark Johnson had a question in the chat. Hey, Mark. He's asking about this same thing about the stage adaptive with, a lot of kids have, varying learning trajectories through the year. Sometimes they get it quickly. Sometimes it takes a little while to hear things over again. I think Tammy said it, that, it's not going to be an issue, because anywhere you end up on the end, you should be able to receive any score on the total score. But he's asking, are there concerns about devaluing the instruction of someone with a varied learner profile or learner trajectory as they move through the year, which model might not fit them. And that goes back to Carla's earlier question, I think, about Carla's earlier question about kids with disability and accessibility.
Well, I think some of the feedback that we continue to get and something that is desired is a system, that is perhaps a more of an item bank, that a teacher could go in and through some, well-specified business rules, select some items to build a personalized assessment for a student based on their needs. And in fact, our overarching system is called the North Carolina Personalized Assessment Tool. And you know how you name something and then it sticks, and yet, you might say to yourself, well, really, was that the best name? But nevertheless, I think that there are many who are hoping. I like Vince's, I wrote this down, Vince, when you said, once a mature system. So, I think those are great words to illustrate that really this is the very beginning of this mindset of doing this work. And as we move further down the path, then potentially maybe we could get somewhere more, that is really truly a more personalized assessment tool. But the only caution there, as we all know, of course, is we don't want to lower expectations. And of course, there's always, I'm sure we all get the same question from individuals who want to test students off grade level, who do not want to test them on grade level, and emphasizing the importance of doing that grade level assessment. So balancing that, but yet I would say that I do think I'm hopeful that there is potential to do this down the road, but I think it comes down to capacity of item banks and capacity of the system itself, and the capacity to have teachers and other educators that are trained that can do this very, very well. We do have an item bank that teachers can go in, or districts can go in and build assessments. I don't know, I would not say that is separate from NC Check-ins 2.0. I would not say that it is necessarily done, and it would not meet our standards all the time for validity or reliability, most certainly. So, you know, understand, and that's one of the things that as a assessment community, of course, we know that we struggle with, correct? Because it's not just a matter of going and selecting some items and putting some items in front of a student. And so that's where it gets very, very difficult and very complicated.
Gina, can I ask another question of these guys?
Go ahead.
I just keep asking. So, you know, one of the things you guys now, some of you have more time under your belt at this than others. Some of you are on the fast track. But if you, you know, sticking with this 3-year model, if you had your druthers, could you think of a design of a 3-year model that you would you like to be employing, and that, like, what have you learned from what you've done so far, and if you were recommending to another state, if you're going to do 3-year, do it this way? Yeah, have any thoughts about that? We don't have to talk politics either. It's fine.
Okay. Well, first and foremost, I'd get the folks that are most affected into the room and ask what this should look like from their perspective. Having those conversations more frequently and upfront would be very helpful. The other thing that I think I really like the concept that we have in terms of having growth and an opportunity to have accountability. I'm not real clear on if we can have within the same system no ceiling and no floor in terms of being able to offer that kind of flexibility on the computer adaptive system. Can we do that within the same system that we also derive the accountability score? So is that possible? I'd like to think that it is, but the other thing is, if we can't, and I know that this is a model that's out there, I'd really like to see having a predictive element that comes off of the growth piece. If we are going to do a growth piece, can we use that then as a predictor of how they're going to perform on the state assessment or accountability performance level? So those are two things that I think we are thinking about and considering and wondering. That's a wondering that I have.
I think policymakers in general would like us to be able to administer a 10-item test and know exactly what students need as far as an instruction. And I think one thing we all struggle with on a daily basis is, how do we manage those expectations? And so I go back to, what is it we're really wanting these through-year assessments to do? Is it to identify gaps in learning? Is it to identify whether the student is on grade level? Is it to measure growth? And, you know, those all have competing design qualities. And so I think one thing I have been struggling with in the current year, where we're measuring on grade level content, is the concern that students are encountering items that they've never been taught the content. And many people have alluded to that in the chat. So I think one thing I've been thinking about is, if I were able to make these decisions, would I instead make the decision that the fall assessment would be based on the previous year's content? That would give us a measure of, you know, learning gaps as we start the year, and it might also give some indication of summer slide. And then perhaps the winter assessment moves on into the on grade level content. I think in my experience with this, the thing I have struggled with the most is the concept of giving kids when they're just coming back to school, in August or September, content that they have not been taught yet. With that said, we give all sorts of instructions to the test examiners to explain to the kids that, we know that they may not have been taught the content, but I think having experienced, 2 different years where the first year we assessed the previous grade levels content and this year we assessed the current, I think I really am struggling with whether it provides more information if we were to do the first assessment based on the previous year's content.
I like our system. I think our system has a lot of promise. And really what we try to anchor on, our team anchors on trying to emphasize giving that information to the teachers and to the parents and to the students, that's what is important, is for them to have that information that they asked for, that they really demanded when they said this end of year assessment is an autopsy exam, information. We want information that we can help the students when we have them. One of the things that we've tried to do that we have not been successful on is we wanted more partnership with our content standards team here at the department. Now, with the original NC check-ins, we had strong partnership at that time with our curriculum colleagues, and they would do webinars with us. And so we would talk about the logistics and the design and the purpose, but they would then take that and actualize that with, okay, here are the content standards and here's how you can use this information in deciding how, next steps for your instruction, which is a key piece of the design. But as time has gone on, this sometimes happens in organizations, we haven't been able to maintain that relationship in that same way. Not to be able to be critical, but just to say that I do think that I have a former colleague one time who said they would really prefer we took all this money on assessment and spend it on content standards. And of course, our assessment purpose is to have that data so we know how kids are doing, and that's exceedingly important in my personal opinion, for policymakers, for parents, for educators, for everyone to have that information. We have to know. It almost would lean me to saying that, but we need to minimize, of course, the footprint of how we get that data and the costs associated with it, and put more of our footprint on the actual strength of the content standards and providing instruction for those. And then we would probably see a change in those test scores. And that's one of the things we're trying to do, is we're trying to take it back to the content. Why did that child select B when the correct answer was A? How are they thinking about that content incorrectly? Not just checking them off because they got it right, or dismissing them because they got it wrong. So I'll pause there.
My apologies. My phone rang and it said Senate office, so I took it.
Woo.
Yep. They jump and how high, right? Yeah.
Well, I want to build off what Tammy was just mentioning. She touched a little bit on cost implications. And, so what have been the cost implications associated with the shift to the 3-year assessment? Both in your contract and have you had to put on additional staff? Has the workload increased, and how much?
On Florida, we spent about $18 million a year on paper. Our assessments in grades 3 through 6 were all paper-based. And so we're still printing some accommodations, but that's probably about 1,000 pieces of paper, 1,000 tests instead of 200,000 per grade and subject. So in that way, we've seen savings. Obviously we actually have tests in K2, we had additional tests there, but that nowhere near digs into the, those savings there. Staff, yes, we've added more positions because spring is busy for testing people. Well, now for us that are doing this, spring, it's busy all year long. So definitely need additional staff, more report, more QC, and more help desk and all those kinds of things. So we've had increased the folks both on the vendor side and our own office.
I believe the vendor has expanded their staff. As far as the contract, I know that there has been an increase to cover the additional behind the scenes work and the reporting and so forth for them. For our NDE staff, we have not increased our staff. We're still the same 5 individuals that were there before through year began.
We have not increased staff either. I'm just feeding them a lot of chocolate to try to keep their spirits up. But we did have an increase in our contract cost because we are essentially adding 2 more test administrations to what we were doing already.
So we have not had an increase in our cost. We have a model where we develop our assessments in-house with a partnership with North Carolina State University. So, you know, it's just a matter of, unfortunately, both teams, both at NC State and our team here at the department, we just have more to do. We have done a couple of very small external contracts, particularly around having an external evaluator and also having some communication support. But those were extremely small given the scope of our overall budget. So we just embedded it in our processes and just upped. So like where before maybe you were doing a guide for the end of grade assessment, now that you're doing a guide for the end of grade assessment and the NC Check-ins 2.0. But that really it goes back to 2015 and has been evolving. So it wasn't like starting from zero and trying to build everything overnight.
Jeff Nelhouse had a good question in the chat. He asked, you know, how do you all distinguish between through year and balanced assessment systems? And even though that's another term we're trying to define, but and I want to just add a little maybe addendum to that is, do you have any worry that by trying to implement a through year, you could actually be killing balanced assessment systems or hindering their development at the local level? But do you distinguish between through year and balanced assessment? If so, how? And are you worried about the blowback effects? Maybe that was a loaded question.
Yeah,
But
well,
so maybe just take Jeff's first part.
Yeah, very, very short, you know, with basically 3 end of year blueprints. I would not classify this as a balanced assessment system, right? It's 3 summative assessments.
Right.
I see 3 years part of the balanced assessment system. It's not more important than, but it's a piece of it. It serves a purpose just as other types of assessment do. And so you need to have, for me, a balanced assessment system means that you have the right assessment for the right purpose. And you don't have any, you try not to have duplication when you have an assessment that has a particular use and purpose, then you shouldn't need to duplicate it for, I guess that's where I'm landing, I guess.
And I think identifying, as Trudy said, the purpose of the assessment and matching it to the type is so important. I also see the through year assessments as a component of a balanced assessment system. And when I think of an assessment system kind of as a pie chart, I think the largest component of a balanced assessment system really does have to be that formative classroom assessment. When we're thinking about assessments function as supporting instruction. I'm not talking about the accountability function, but I guess I agree with you all. I see it as a component of a balanced assessment system, but again, the weight should be on that everyday classroom assessment that really informs instruction.
Absolutely agree.
Yeah, and I agree as well wholeheartedly. And I think that's what we're trying to do, but I will say it is an uphill climb. The emphasis, the priority, the focus is on that end of year assessment or whatever assessment that accountability rating or the accountability data comes from. That is the focus. That is the emphasis in a school. And so what we're trying, to do is say, work on the content, work on figuring out how you could help students, and that'll help you with them being better prepared for that end of year assessment. But I love the illustration of the pie chart, Shelley, and think that would be, perfect, that it should be the bigger piece. It's almost like all the work that you do to prepare for a marathon, that is more important than showing up for the day of the marathon, right? Because if you're not prepared and you're training before, you can show up for the marathon and have great equipment and have great people cheering you on, but you may not do very well if you didn't actually do all the prep. And so I think shifting to that is very hard. I well remember being a small child and, back in the forever ago, right? And bringing home a test report, because we had standardized tests back then, not very many, not very often, but bringing it home to my parents, and my parents just kind of looking at it and moving on. Nowadays, parents, would be very similar to my parents. They would not just look at that and put it over to the side. I mean, our communities, our parents, our students, as my little niece said, of course, we're stressed out. We may not be able to go to the next grade, and there's no danger of her going to the next grade, but in her mind, there is. And I think that tells a lot of the story. So the emphasis is on the end of grade, and it's hard to shift it to really the through grade. And even if I may, having the model where we're testing all those content standards, I think as Shelley said, doing it in August or September before those students have had instruction. That right there is saying that what we're focusing on right here at the very beginning of the year is that end, instead of getting you there throughout the year. So it's a difficult situation to be in, and again, it's an uphill climb.
Okay, well, we're coming really close to the end of our session today, and I just want to see if anyone wants to give a final piece of advice or a final comment for states considering the transition to through-year assessment.
Get your stakeholders to the table often, and get as many folks that are in the classroom and those that are dealing with the reports. Absolutely get them there. The day-to-day operations, get them there, and then talk about it. Just make sure that your why is front and center, and it's clear, concise, and something that can be relatable to the folks that are, again, going to be the ones that are carrying this out.
And I would say be willing to change along the way. We've made lots of changes. We get feedback, and as we get feedback, we can consider what we're doing, and we do it differently. So as much as we possibly can. And I think that goes back to what Trudy is saying, having those conversations and getting that information and then acting on it as much as possible. And I think the field appreciates that and makes them feel as though they're involved and they're part of it.
Reach out to your tax early and often. Keep them updated. Marianne Perry's on here is like, and their strong feelings on a potential change to what we're doing really help win the day with leadership. So your tax are there to help.
I think because often these assessments are driven by policymakers, it's helping to identify the ultimate purpose of the assessments early on, and then managing the expectations that these assessments probably can't do everything that folks want them to do and do it well. I think the other thing is keeping in mind that whatever we do, it should be part of a larger assessment system, and not forgetting that on the ground, everyday classroom assessment is so important.
That's great advice, Shelley. So if I may, one thing I would say is, and again, you guys are often legislatively or otherwise statutorily constrained, but be really clear about the problems you're trying to solve, and it's so built on what Shelley said, and then keep checking the logic, whether it's a theory of action as formal as that or something less formal. Keep checking the logic against that ability to solve those problems, and then start collecting evidence in a validity evaluation to see if in fact you are supporting these intended purposes and uses, and actually making a dent in the perceived problems. So I admire you guys because I know where you guys sit in between that rock and a hard place, and you do it with grace. It's really impressive.
Well,
Thank
thank
you,
you
and
all
thank
for
you,
great
Pam.
conversation.
I just
Mm.
wanted to thank everyone for being here, and Tammy, Shelley, and Vince, I learned from you, so thank you very much. Appreciate that. And Scott, I guess I'll include Scott. I did learn from you
Yeah,
as well.
yeah. Sometimes it happens by accident.
Well, again, thank you all for this great conversation and to
Yeah.
our audience for great questions. We really appreciate this opportunity and the fantastic participation we've had today. And so
Yeah.
thanks from all of us.
And Regina, thanks to you for pulling it together. Really
Yeah, thanks,
appreciate it.
Regina. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah.
Shelley, Trudy, and Tammy.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Bye, guys. Thank you all.
Take care. Bye.